My name's Eliana, I'm 28, and last Thanksgiving I sat at my family's dinner table only to be mocked as the broke one, the failure. They laughed at me, dismissed me, and treated me like I had nothing. But that night, my father noticed something on my wrist that changed everything. This is my story. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories on family drama and emotional courage. The November air had that sharp chill that cut right through you, even with a coat on. I sat in my car for a good 10 minutes before walking up to my parents' house, staring at the warm glow of the windows, knowing exactly what waited inside. Thanksgiving. Family. Laughter. Mockery. It was all the same for me every year, and yet, somehow, it still managed to sting worse each time. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My old sedan, with its squeaky brakes and stubborn heater, had been with me since college. To my family, it was proof of failure. To me, it was a reminder of the choices I made, choices that no one around that dinner table would ever understand. Finally, I forced myself to open the door. The cold bit at my cheeks as I walked up the driveway, every crunch of the gravel beneath my boots echoing like a warning bell. I had been called sensitive before, dramatic even, but I wasn't imagining what awaited me. My family had a way of turning every gathering into a competition, and I was always the easiest target. The door swung open before I could even knock. My younger brother, Tyler, grinned at me, half drunk already, holding a glass of something amber. "Look who finally showed up," he said, stepping aside with exaggerated flair. "Miss Independent, rolling in with her luxury ride." His words dripped sarcasm. I forced a smile. "Good to see you too, Tyler." The smell of roasted turkey, cinnamon pie, and garlic mashed potatoes wrapped around me as I stepped inside. My mom's house always smelled like comfort, but for me, comfort ended at the nose. Once I crossed into the living room, the comfort ended, and the judgment began. Ellie, my cousin Marissa, called from the couch, holding her phone high like she was mid-selfie. "Still single, still broke? Or did you finally land that rich husband?" Her giggle set off a round of chuckles from the cousins gathered around her. I swallowed hard, biting the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper. I wanted to snap back, but instead, I hung my coat, brushed off the jab, and walked toward the kitchen. Dad was there, basting the turkey, humming quietly to himself. He glanced up, and his face softened the moment he saw me. "Eliana," he said warmly, as though my name actually meant something to him. For a moment, I felt safe. But the moment passed quickly. Mom bustled by, barely making eye contact. "Don't forget to wash up. Dinner's almost ready." I washed my hands at the sink, staring at my reflection in the tiny kitchen window. My hair was tied back in a low ponytail, my sweater was thrifted, my jeans worn. I looked every bit the picture of someone barely scraping by. It was by design. What they didn't see, what I'd carefully hidden, was that beneath the surface, I was sitting on a fortune most of them couldn't even imagine. I kept my wealth private for a reason. I had watched too many people's attitudes change the moment money came into the picture. Genuine care turned into greed. Supportive words turned into envy. I'd learned the hard way that privacy was my greatest protection. Still, hiding meant enduring nights like these. The dining table was already set when I walked in, Mom's best china, crystal glasses she only used twice a year, and that giant turkey centerpiece. Everyone found their seats, and I slipped into mine near the end of the table. I always got the far corner. Out of the spotlight, out of the way, yet never out of reach of their jokes. "Ellie, did you bring anything?" Aunt Carol asked across the table, her voice dripping with judgment masked as politeness. "I made cornbread," I said quietly. She smirked. "Oh, bless your heart. That's simple." I clenched my jaw. Carol always brought extravagant dishes, bragging about her gourmet skills like she was auditioning for a cooking show. Her words weren't about food, they were a reminder. Simple. Basic. Bare minimum. That's what they thought of me. As dishes were passed around, the laughter grew louder, the wine poured heavier, and the jokes sharper. Tyler boasted about his new SUV. Marissa bragged about her fiancé's six-figure job. My sister, Emily, announced her second pregnancy, and the table erupted in applause. And then, as if on cue, the conversation turned to me. "So, Eliana," Uncle Bob said, his voice booming across the table, "still working at that, what do you call it? Freelance thing?" His smirk was joined by a chorus of laughter. "Yeah," Tyler added. "Does that even pay the bills, or are you living on ramen noodles still?" I gripped my fork so tightly it nearly bent. They thought they were clever. They thought mocking me was harmless fun. But each word cut deeper than they realized. "Leave her alone," Dad said mildly, but his voice didn't carry far enough. The jokes continued, layering one on top of another. I stayed silent, but inside, my thoughts churned. They had no idea that my so-called freelance thing had grown into a thriving business. They didn't know about the properties I owned, the investments I'd nurtured, or the quiet millions sitting in my accounts. They only saw the surface, a modest girl with nothing to show for herself. As the turkey was carved and plates filled, I drifted into my own thoughts. I remembered the sleepless nights, the risks I took when no one believed in me, the failures that had almost broken me. I remembered crying in that same old sedan after a deal went wrong, wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. And I remembered the moment everything turned when I closed my first major contract and realized I was building something real, something lasting. Those memories fueled me as I sat there, surrounded by laughter at my expense. I wasn't broken. I wasn't a failure. I was a secret storm, and they hadn't seen me coming. At that moment, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I glanced down discreetly. A message from one of my partners lit up the screen. "Deal closed. Congratulations, we just hit another milestone." My heart skipped. They were mocking me for being broke while, in real time, I was making more money than any of them had seen in their lives. I looked up, catching my father's gaze across the table. He was watching me carefully, almost suspiciously, as though he could sense something different about me. I gave him a small, reassuring smile. He didn't smile back. Instead, his eyes dropped to my wrist, lingering just a little too long. And though no one else noticed, I knew right then the fire was only beginning. The laughter didn't die, it sharpened. It sliced through the air, bouncing off the polished wood table and ricocheting straight into me. Forks clinked against china, wine sloshed in glasses, and voices overlapped in a messy chorus. If you didn't know better, you'd think it was an ordinary family dinner, warm, loud, and full of love. But sitting there, I knew better. I was the punchline, and they weren't finished with me yet. Tyler leaned back in his chair, smirking. "So, Ellie," he said, dragging out my name the way he always did when he wanted to irritate me, "are you still doing that, whatever it is you call work? Freelance? Side hustle? Selling crafts on the internet?" A few chuckles rippled around the table. Marissa rolled her eyes so dramatically I thought they might stick. "Probably still living on instant noodles. I swear, Ellie, you're like a college freshman who never grew up." I stabbed a piece of turkey with my fork, forcing myself to chew slowly, calmly. Their voices buzzed around me like mosquitoes. I wanted to swat them away, but I knew that would only give them more power. Then Aunt Carol chimed in, her tone syrupy sweet but with that sharp edge she always carried. "You know, Eliana, there's no shame in asking for help. Maybe one of us could find you something stable. Lord knows a woman your age should have security by now." "Yeah," Tyler added with a grin. "Like a husband who can pay the bills." More laughter. I felt heat rise to my cheeks, but I kept my face neutral. "Mom, can I have more rolls?" Little Jacob, my cousin's 8-year-old son, piped up. His innocent voice broke the tension for a moment, but only briefly. Marissa turned back to me, her glossy lips curled in amusement. "Seriously though, Eliana, what do you do all day? Don't you get bored?" There it was, the question they'd been circling, waiting to pounce. The one that made my chest tighten every year. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because any answer I gave would be twisted into something laughable. Before I could respond, Tyler chuckled and said, "Probably binge-watching shows and napping. Must be nice." I forced myself to swallow another bite of turkey, though it felt like gravel in my throat. Uncle Bob, who had already had one too many glasses of wine, leaned forward. "You know, Eliana, when I was your age, I already had a mortgage, a minivan, and 3 kids. You can't just coast through life forever. His words stung, not because they were true, but because of the smugness behind them. He didn't know a single thing about me beyond the facade I let them see. Suddenly, a glass tipped. Red wine splashed across the table, spreading like blood across the white tablecloth. Gasps and groans filled the room. "Tyler, watch what you're doing," Mom snapped, grabbing napkins. "Relax, it's just wine," Tyler muttered, blotting at the mess. But I noticed the way his eyes darted to me, as if somehow I had caused it by existing. The commotion gave me a small reprieve, but only a small one. As soon as the table was cleaned, the spotlight swung back to me. "So, Ellie," Aunt Carol said again, "really, tell us, what's your plan? You can't just float forever." My fork hovered above my plate. A dozen responses burned on my tongue, but I swallowed them all. Instead, I gave a small shrug. "I'm managing." The table erupted with laughter again. Emily, my older sister, shook her head with exaggerated pity. "Managing? That's what people say when they're drowning." I clenched my hands under the table. The edge of my fork dug into my palm. Dad cleared his throat. "That's enough," he said, but his voice was softer than the laughter. They barely heard him. As if on cue, Marissa pulled out her phone. She angled it toward me, her fingers flying across the screen. "Smile, Ellie," she teased. "I'm just telling Instagram how our family's favorite free spirit is still broke." The table roared. My jaw tightened. "Marissa, that's not funny," Dad said, sharper this time. "Oh, come on, it's a joke," she said, laughing, but she didn't put her phone away. I wanted to snatch it out of her hand, to show them all the bank notifications I'd received that very week, the deals I'd closed, the millions sitting quietly in accounts with my name on them. But that wasn't my style. Let them laugh. Just then, Jacob tugged at my sleeve. His big brown eyes looked up at me, curious. "Ellie, do you really not have a job?" The table burst out laughing again, louder than before, because it sounded so innocent coming from him. Something inside me cracked, not broken, but shifted. I looked at Jacob, and instead of feeling humiliated, I felt a strange sense of calm. He didn't know better. He was only repeating what he heard from them. The poison they fed each other at this table had trickled down to him. I leaned down and whispered softly, "Don't believe everything grown-ups say, Jacob. Sometimes they're wrong." He blinked at me, then nodded solemnly, as if I'd just handed him a secret. The table quieted for just a moment, confusion flickering across a few faces. But the silence didn't last. Tyler smirked again. "What's next, Ellie? Moving back in with Mom and Dad? Oh wait, your room's already the storage closet." Another round of laughter. Even Mom cracked a smile this time, though she quickly covered it with her napkin. And there it was. My trial, right there in the open. Every forkful of food punctuated with another jab. Every sip of wine lubricating sharper words. I sat there, enduring it, letting the storm rage while I stayed still. But inside, I was anything but still. My phone buzzed again in my pocket. Another notification. Another deal. Another reminder of the empire I'd built that none of them could see. I pressed my hand against my leg, steadying myself. They could mock me all they wanted. They could laugh until their throats went hoarse. But the truth was already on my wrist, gleaming under the chandelier light. And soon enough, it would speak louder than I ever could. The chandelier's light caught on my wrist again, bouncing off the polished glass face of the watch. I could feel it pressing lightly against my skin, a quiet reminder of everything I carried beneath their shallow judgments. They laughed, they poked, they prodded, but inside, I sat steady, anchored by something deeper than their voices could touch. My fork scraped against the plate, a soft sound that seemed swallowed by the rising chatter. Tyler was back to bragging about his new car, a sleek machine he financed with more debt than sense. Marissa scrolled through her phone between bites, her laughter spilling out every time she found something new to mock. The table felt like a stage, each of them playing their parts, while I remained the silent audience. I shifted slightly in my chair, straightening my back. There was power in stillness, I realized. Power in refusing to rise to their bait. Mom caught my eye briefly from across the table. For a fleeting second, I thought I saw something there, a shadow of guilt, maybe, or hesitation. But just as quickly, she looked away, fussing with the gravy boat, as though she couldn't quite bear to meet my gaze for long. "Ellie, you're so quiet," Aunt Carol said suddenly, tilting her head. "You used to be so talkative. What happened?" I pressed my napkin to my lips, buying time. Quiet wasn't weakness. Quiet was choice. "Sometimes it's better to listen," I said softly. The words landed like a pebble in a pond, small, but the ripples spread. For a moment, silence stretched across the table. Then Tyler snorted. "Listen to what? Us telling the truth." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Instead, I let my gaze wander around the room. The crystal glasses catching the light. The smell of roasted turkey and baked yams heavy in the air. The distant tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Every detail anchored me, pulled me into the present. This was my family, yes, but it was also just noise. And I wasn't obligated to absorb their chaos. Jacob, still seated beside me, leaned closer. "Ellie, do you want my biscuit?" he whispered, holding out the warm bread roll in his small hand. I smiled, accepting it. "Thanks, buddy." It was such a simple gesture, but it grounded me more than anything else that evening. In a room full of adults trying to diminish me, a child had shown the purest kindness. I tore the biscuit in half and placed the other piece back on his plate. "We'll share," I told him. His grin was wide and toothy, and for the first time all night, warmth bloomed in my chest. The others barely noticed. They were too wrapped up in their own noise. Marissa was showing off her manicure. Tyler was recounting his latest promotion, carefully exaggerating every detail for maximum effect. Uncle Bob was launching into a story he'd told at least a dozen times before. Their words swirled around me, but I no longer felt caged by them. Instead, I sat quietly, letting the calm build inside me. I didn't need to interrupt. I didn't need to correct them. My silence was not their victory, it was my shield. At one point, Emily leaned in from across the table. "You know, Ellie," she said, her tone feigning sympathy, "it wouldn't hurt to speak up for yourself sometimes. People might respect you more if you did." I lifted my eyes to hers and held her gaze. "Respect isn't given because you demand it at the table," I said evenly. "It's earned in the life you live when nobody's watching." Her smirk faltered, just slightly, before she quickly sipped her wine and looked away. I returned to my plate, unhurried. Each bite was measured, each movement deliberate. It wasn't an act, I truly felt it. A kind of strength I hadn't fully realized I possessed until that moment. The room grew warmer as the night wore on. Conversations splintered into smaller groups, but every so often, I could feel their eyes darting toward me, waiting for me to crack, to rise, to defend myself. I didn't. When Aunt Carol launched into a rant about her neighbor's new landscaping, I tuned out the words and focused on the rhythm of her voice. When Tyler bragged about his latest bonus, I noticed instead how his fingers twitched nervously against his glass, betraying a confidence more fragile than he'd ever admit. I began to see them differently, not as giants towering over me with judgment, but as flawed people, desperately patching their own insecurities with noise. And in that realization, my own silence became a kind of quiet rebellion. Jacob nudged me again, whispering conspiratorially, "I think Uncle Tyler talks too much." I covered my smile with my napkin, nodding. "Me too." We shared a quiet laugh, unnoticed by the rest. The night stretched on. Dessert was served, pumpkin pie with whipped cream, apple crumble still warm from the oven. The sweetness filled the air, masking some of the bitterness that had lingered through the meal. Yet even as they ate, the subtle digs didn't stop. A comment about my clothes here, a jab about my lifestyle there. But with every word, I felt less pierced by their barbs. Their voices became background noise, like the hum of an old refrigerator, irritating if you focused on it, but easy to ignore once you learned how. I poured myself another glass of water, the coolness soothing as it slid down my throat. My hand brushed the watch again, and I let my thumb rest against the smooth edge of the dial. A small smile tugged at my lips. They didn't know. They didn't need to know, not yet. For now, my strength was in restraint. In the choice not to shatter their illusions with a single sentence. in holding the truth close, like a flame I could release whenever I decided. The night ended with coats being pulled from hooks and car keys jingling. Goodbyes were exchanged at the door, laughter spilling into the cold night air. Tyler slapped me on the back with mock cheer. "Same time next year, Ellie? Maybe you'll surprise us by then." I smiled faintly, meeting his eyes. "Maybe I already have." He laughed, not realizing the weight of my words, and turned away. As the door closed behind the last of them, silence finally settled over the house. Real silence, thick, peaceful, unbroken. I stood in the middle of the empty dining room, the dishes still cluttering the table, the scent of pie still lingering. My hand brushed the watch one final time, and I let the quiet wash over me. Silent strength. That was mine. And it was more unshakable than anything they could ever imagine. The house was quiet after everyone left, but my mind wasn't. I stood in the dining room surrounded by half-empty glasses, stained napkins, and crumbs scattered like little reminders of the night's cruelty. My hand went again to the watch on my wrist, the one no one at the table seemed to notice except Dad. The metal was cool beneath my fingers, its weight both comforting and dangerous. That watch carried a story, and tonight, for the first time, it felt like it wanted to speak. I remembered when I first bought it. It wasn't just a purchase, it was a moment of triumph. After years of working quietly, saving relentlessly, and investing when no one was paying attention, I walked into the store alone. The glass cases shimmered with possibilities, but this watch, the one on my wrist, stood out. It wasn't flashy, but it held presence. I knew right then it wasn't about the time it told, it was about the story it would one day tell for me. And tonight, it almost did. I sank into one of the chairs, the cushion still warm from where Tyler had Saturday. I closed my eyes, letting the silence stretch. Dad had noticed the watch. I'd caught the flicker in his eyes, the subtle pause mid-sentence. He hadn't said much, but his silence was louder than anything the others had thrown my way. Footsteps creaked down the hallway. Dad appeared in the doorway, his hands tucked into his sweater pockets. His eyes scanned the messy table before settling on me. "You're still here," he said softly. I gave a half-smile. "Someone has to clean this up." He walked over slowly, picking up a stray fork and setting it in a pile. For a while, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the faint clinks of silverware being gathered, the shuffle of plates being stacked. Then, quietly, he said, "That's quite a watch you've got there." The words hung in the air. I looked down at it, the face catching the chandelier's glow again. "Yeah, it is." He studied me carefully. "Most people wouldn't notice. But I've seen enough of the world to know when something isn't ordinary." A rush of heat spread through my chest. He wasn't mocking me. He wasn't asking out of idle curiosity. He knew. Maybe not the whole truth, but enough to sense the gap between their laughter and my reality. "Where'd you get it?" he asked gently, pulling out the chair across from me and sitting down. For a moment, I considered brushing it off. I could laugh, make up a story about a thrift shop find or a lucky gift. But something in his eyes, steady, searching, kind, made me pause. "I bought it," I said finally. My voice was quiet, but steady. "With my own money." He leaned back slightly, his brows lifting just enough to show he understood the weight of those words. "That's not a small purchase," he said. "No," I agreed. "It's not." Silence again. The kind that carried more meaning than conversation. I traced the rim of my glass with one finger, the condensation dampening my skin. "They think I'm broke, Dad. That I've failed. And I let them think that." His eyes softened. "Why?" I swallowed hard, the truth pressing at the back of my throat. "Because it's easier." "Because if they knew," I trailed off, not sure how much I was ready to say. Dad didn't push. He just nodded slowly, as though he understood without needing the full picture. The clock in the hall ticked steadily, filling the space between us. "Finally," I said, "this watch, it reminds me that I'm not who they think I am. That their words don't define me." Dad's gaze lowered to my wrist again, lingering there. Then he looked back up, his voice quiet but firm. "You don't owe anyone an explanation, Eliana. Least of all them." I blinked, caught off guard by his tone. He wasn't defending them, wasn't brushing aside what had happened at the table. He was standing with me. And in that moment, the watch spoke louder than it ever had before, not through its ticking hands, but through the silence it filled. I realized then that the watch wasn't just a secret marker of wealth. It was a reminder of endurance. Of the countless late nights I'd worked when everyone else had gone home. Of the small sacrifices, the meals skipped, the risks taken. Of the quiet victories no one had cheered for. Every scratch on its band was a memory. Every polished edge was a choice. Dad leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "They mocked you tonight," he said plainly. "But I saw you. You didn't break. You didn't fight back. You just sat there." I nodded. Because fighting back wouldn't have changed anything. "They don't listen." His lips curved slightly. "Sometimes silence is the loudest answer." For the first time all night, my chest felt lighter. We talked for a while longer, about little things, the weather, the football game he'd watched earlier, the new bird feeder he was planning to put up. Ordinary conversation, but it felt grounding. Comforting. When he finally stood to leave, he placed a hand on my shoulder. "Eliana," he said quietly, "don't let them convince you you're less. You carry more than they can even see." I looked up at him, words stuck in my throat. All I could do was nod. After he left, I sat alone at the table again. The house was still. My watch ticked softly, each second echoing louder in my mind. I lifted my wrist, holding it up to the light. "One day," I whispered, "they'll understand. But not tonight." Tonight, silence was enough. The watch glowed faintly, catching the last light of the chandelier before the bulbs flickered out. I leaned back, closing my eyes, and let the quiet truth settle over me like a blanket. The chandelier flickered once more before finally settling into darkness, leaving only the soft glow from the hallway lamp. I sat still at the table, the hum of silence pressing in around me. My watch ticked steadily on my wrist, its rhythm somehow louder now, as though reminding me that time never stopped, not for mockery, not for judgment, not even for family. I rose slowly, pushing back the chair. The legs scraped lightly against the hardwood, the sound sharp in the stillness. My hands moved automatically, stacking plates, gathering silverware, clearing away the crumbs. There was something almost therapeutic in the act. Each dish I set aside felt like shedding one more piece of the evening's weight. But no matter how much I cleared, the words lingered. Broke. Failure. Disappointment. They echoed in my memory, each one a reminder of the roles they had cast me in without my consent. I paused, gripping the edge of the table. Did I want to carry their voices any longer? Or was it time, finally time, to walk away, not just from the dinner table, but from the power they thought they held over me? The thought settled in my chest like a quiet flame. A creak from the hallway pulled me from my reflection. Jacob stood there, rubbing his eyes, holding his stuffed bear by the arm. His hair was tousled, his pajama shirt crooked. "Ellie." His voice was groggy but curious. "Why are you still awake?" I smiled softly. "Just cleaning up, buddy. Couldn't sleep yet." He padded over to me, dragging the bear behind him. "They were mean to you." His words were simple, but they cut sharper than anything my relatives had said. I crouched down to meet his eyes. "Yeah, they were. But you know what?" "What?" I tapped his nose gently. "Mean words don't decide who we are. We do." He tilted his head, thinking about it, then nodded as though he understood. "I like your watch," he added suddenly. "It's shiny." I laughed softly, brushing his hair back. "Thanks, Jacob. It's special to me." He leaned against my shoulder, yawning. "Don't tell them. They don't deserve to know." His words startled me. I looked at him, this little boy barely old enough to tie his own shoes, and yet somehow he grasped the truth better than most adults in that house. "You're right," I whispered. "They don't deserve to know." I walked him back to his room, tucking him in beneath the soft quilt. He drifted off almost instantly, his breathing evening out into the quiet rhythm of sleep. I stood there for a moment longer, watching him, letting the innocence of his presence settle the turbulence in my chest. When I returned to the dining room, the mess didn't look so heavy anymore. I finished cleaning, washed my hands, and finally finally allowed myself to stand in front of the mirror near the entryway. The reflection staring back at me wasn't the girl they'd mocked. It wasn't the failure they imagined. It was a woman who had survived storms they couldn't even comprehend. A woman who had built herself brick by brick, dollar by dollar, without anyone's applause. I touched the watch again, the metal cool against my skin. Tonight, it had spoken, but tomorrow, it would guide me. The decision settled in me then, firm and unshakable. I would keep my truth to myself. Not out of fear, not out of shame, but because real power wasn't in proving them wrong, it was in living so fully, so freely, that their opinions became meaningless background noise. Power wasn't loud. It didn't shout. Power was walking away knowing you didn't need their validation, their acceptance, or even their understanding. I grabbed my coat from the rack and stepped outside. The night air was crisp, brushing against my face like a quiet blessing. The street was empty, the only sound the distant bark of a dog and the soft rustle of leaves in the trees. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with cold clarity. I walked down the driveway, each step steady, purposeful. Behind me, the house stood tall and silent, filled with the voices that had tried to define me. Ahead of me stretched the road, dark, uncertain, but mine. Entirely mine. As I reached the corner, I pulled out my phone and glanced at a notification, a message from a client confirming another deal closed. Another step forward in the empire I'd built quietly, while they had been too busy laughing at ghosts of who they thought I was. I smiled, slipping the phone back into my pocket. They could have their illusions. I had reality. And reality was stronger. I didn't need a grand declaration, a dramatic unveiling, or even revenge. My life itself was the answer. The more I lived, the more their voices faded into static. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed midnight. A new day had begun. I tightened my coat around me, the watch pressing against my wrist like a heartbeat. Its presence wasn't just wealth, it was resilience, proof, reminder. Walking away didn't mean defeat. Walking away meant choosing peace over pettiness, truth over validation, strength over noise. And so I walked. Down the street, into the night, carrying nothing but my silent strength and the quiet power of knowing who I was. Not broke. Not a failure. Whole. Steady. Unshakable. Walking away had never felt so much like winning.